When you step into an argument with a person driven by narcissistic traits, you're not stepping into a conversation. You're stepping into a psychological battlefield. And the first mistake most people make is assuming that both sides are playing the same game. They aren't. You may be arguing for clarity, fairness, or mutual understanding. They are arguing for dominance, validation, and emotional control. Until you understand this difference, you lose before you even begin. Carl Jung often spoke about the shadow, the unseen forces that govern behavior from beneath consciousness. Narcissistic behavior lives almost entirely in that shadow. Their need to win, their need to be right, their need to preserve a fragile inner image. It doesn't come from strength. It comes from fear. But that fear is expertly disguised behind confidence, charm, or aggression. And if you don't see it for what it really is, you take their reactions personally. And that emotional reaction is exactly what feeds the conflict. So the real power begins with detachment. Not coldness, not withdrawal, but psychological distance. The ability to observe the game without being pulled into it. When you stop reacting to the performance, you reclaim the energy they rely on to stay in control. You begin to see their tactics, not as personal attacks, but predictable patterns. And once something becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. Winning isn't about defeating them. It's about refusing to participate in dynamics that drain you. It's about using awareness as your shield and calm as your strategy. When you truly see the battlefield, you stop walking into traps. And that alone changes everything. Clarity is power, and once you have it, no one can use confusion against you again. When you find yourself in conflict with someone driven by narcissistic traits, the real struggle isn't about logic or truth. It's about emotional momentum. These individuals don't win arguments by presenting stronger evidence. They win by destabilizing your emotional center. They pull you into a psychological storm where clarity dissolves and your reactions become their leverage. And the moment you lose your inner balance, the argument stops being about the issue and becomes a stage for their dominance. Carl Jung often emphasized that emotional control is a function of consciousness. The more aware you are of what's moving inside you, the less anyone else can manipulate it from the outside. When you stay calm, you interrupt the pattern that narcissistic behavior depends on. They rely on escalation, raised voices, frustration, defensiveness, emotional overstimulation. But when you remain steady, something remarkable happens. Their strategy collapses. They can't fuel the fire if you refuse to burn. This doesn't mean becoming passive or quiet. It means becoming grounded. It means responding instead of reacting. It means recognizing that their emotional intensity is not an invitation to match it, but a signal to step back into yourself. When you control the emotional climate, you set the tempo of the interaction. And people who thrive on chaos cannot maintain power in a calm environment. The irony is that your calmness often feels like an attack to them, because it denies them the drama they're trying to create. But this is precisely why it's effective. You're not fighting them. You're refusing to be drafted into a psychological war you never agreed to. Control the atmosphere, and you control the outcome. Your calm is not weakness. It's the quiet force that dismantles manipulation at its roots. There comes a moment in every difficult interaction when you realize that the argument isn't actually about the words being exchanged. It's about energy. A person driven by narcissistic traits doesn't argue to understand or resolve. They argue to sustain a certain emotional charge. Their power comes from creating chaos, provoking reactions, and pulling you into a narrative where they control the rhythm. And this is where the subtle art of limited responses becomes one of the most effective tools you'll ever use. When Jung spoke about the tension of opposites, he didn't just describe inner conflicts. He revealed how people often feed each other's unconscious patterns. The more you explain, defend, justify, or over-communicate, the more you feed the dynamic they need to maintain control. But when you shift into short, calm, neutral replies, you introduce a new psychological reality they struggle to navigate. A reality where their emotional intensity has nowhere to land. Simple phrases like, "I understand," or "You may be right," don't mean you agree. They mean you refuse to become an actor in their emotional theater. You're signaling that the conversation will not escalate, no matter how hard they try to provoke it. This creates a kind of psychological silence, not the absence of words, but the absence of emotional fuel. And silence, in these situations, is not emptiness, it is disruption. What makes limited responses so powerful is that they expose the imbalance in the interaction. When one person stops feeding the cycle, the entire cycle weakens. Their argumentative momentum fizzles because there is nothing left to push against. You're not defeating them. You're disengaging from the role they need you to play. When you master restraint, you turn the argument into a mirror, and they can no longer fight their reflection. There's a moment in these difficult interactions when you realize that the argument has drifted far away from anything grounded in reality. You began with a simple point, a clear observation, or a reasonable boundary. But somewhere along the way, the conversation transformed into a maze of accusations, emotional exaggerations, and shifting narratives. This isn't accidental. A person driven by narcissistic traits depends on distortion, because distortion creates confusion, and confusion creates control. When you're unsure of the truth, you become easier to manipulate. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious often bends reality to protect the ego, especially when the ego feels threatened. Narcissistic behavior operates on this principle constantly. The story changes, the facts are rearranged, the meanings are twisted, not to deceive you, but to protect their fragile self-concept. The more emotionally entangled you become in their version of the story, the more power they gain over the direction of the argument. This is why returning to reality is not only a strategy, it's a lifeline. When you calmly bring the focus back to what actually happened, to what was actually said, to what is actually relevant, you pull the interaction out of the emotional fog. You disrupt the narrative they're trying to create, and you do it without aggression, because aggression only fuels the distortion further. The key is steadiness, not confrontation, but clarity. You don't argue with the exaggeration, you simply refuse to follow it. You anchor yourself in facts the way a ship anchors itself during a storm, not to stop the storm, but to prevent being carried away by it. When you bring the conversation back to truth, their illusions lose their power. Clarity dissolves manipulation because reality, when held firmly, cannot be rewritten by anyone's insecurity. At some point, you begin to understand that not every battle is won through confrontation. Some of the most powerful victories happen quietly, through boundaries so subtle and consistent that the other person never sees them being drawn. When dealing with someone driven by narcissistic traits, these invisible boundaries become essential. Not because you want to control them, but because you need to protect your psychological center. Their behavior often thrives in environments without limits, where emotional access is unrestricted and your availability becomes their leverage. Jung often spoke about the importance of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, distinct self. Boundaries are part of this process. They are not walls that shut people out, but lines that define where you end and where another begins. A person who operates through manipulation, projection, or emotional volatility has difficulty respecting this distinction. They interpret your availability as permission to intrude, your patience as weakness, and your empathy as an invitation to control. That is why your boundaries must be quiet but firm, not explained, not defended, simply lived. A boundary can be as simple as delaying your response, choosing not to react emotionally, or ending the conversation the moment it turns chaotic. It is the act of deciding within yourself what you will and will not participate in. And once that decision becomes consistent, something subtle shifts. The dynamic loses its intensity. The other person feels the difference, even if they can't articulate it. They sense that they no longer have the same access to your emotional world. The beauty of invisible boundaries is that they require no argument. They require no permission. They are a declaration of self, respect expressed through action rather than words. When you honor your limits, you silently redefine the entire relationship without ever raising your voice. There comes a stage in these interactions when you realize that the real power doesn't lie in winning arguments, correcting distortions, or even enforcing boundaries. The real power lies in detachment, the kind of inner separation that allows you to stand in the presence of another person's emotional storms without being swept into them. This isn't coldness, it isn't indifference, it's clarity. It's the recognition that you cannot control another person's behavior, but you can absolutely control the meaning you assign to it. People driven by narcissistic patterns depend on your emotional involvement. They thrive when you react, defend, explain, or spiral. The moment you step back internally, when you observe rather than absorb, the dynamic changes at a fundamental level. Jung often emphasized that individuation requires stepping out of collective emotional patterns and reclaiming your inner authority. That's precisely what happens here. You stop participating in the script they're trying to write for you. Strategic detachment means you no longer respond from woundedness. You respond from awareness. Their criticism loses its sting because you no longer internalize it. Their manipulation loses its force because you no longer feel responsible for it. Their unpredictability loses its power because you are no longer seeking stability through them. You stop needing them to change in order for you to feel grounded. And that is the psychological shift they cannot navigate. The irony is that detachment often feels to them like you've become a mystery, No longer predictable, no longer reactive, no longer available for emotional extraction. But this mystery isn't a tactic. It's simply the natural state of someone who has reclaimed their autonomy. When you detach, you don't win by overpowering them. You win by becoming untouchable. Real freedom begins the moment you stop giving anyone the power to disturb your inner world.